Hi, and welcome to this week's lecture on More Than a Score. This week, or in this lesson rather, we're going to take a step away from what we've been reading and really get into what I think will parallel some of the personal experiences that we've been having with respect to standardized testing. Um, that idea of being more than a score, I think, lies at the core of what we hear from parents and students and teachers who have been really objecting to how prominent standardized testing has become in the lives of schools. So we're going to do that in two parts. The agenda for this lesson first is looking at how did we get to this kind of common sense notion around what standardized testing means, and that it means that our teachers and our schools are doing a poor job. And then we're going to walk through a little bit of what you're going to get in the More Than a Score excerpts that we're going to read and watch. So Kevin Kumashiro has been the Dean of the University of San Francisco School of Education. And he wrote a book called Bad Teachers and how blaming teachers distorts the bigger picture. And he kind of breaks this down into what appears to be common sense around teaching. The first piece of common sense here is the idea that, well, if we have good teachers, then we must have good schools. But then we have these low test scores. And so if we're not talking about what's going on in the bigger system of education, if we're not talking about poverty, if we're not talking about the under-resourcing of schools, if we're not talking about all the different pressures that are applying to schools and all the ways in which schools are failing our kids, you kind of mush all that together and you come out with the idea that, well, if we have low test scores, then that must mean we have bad teachers. And that's become a sort of common sense notion of what's going on in schools. But now we're going to hear and read several voices. First, you're going to hear from Jesse Hagopian. So Jesse is a math teacher in Seattle, and he said, listen, I'm not going to be giving the PARCC, well, it wasn't PARCC in Washington, but it was the equivalent of that, to my students because it doesn't reflect what I've been teaching and it will be a poor representation of what they've been learning. And it will reflect badly on them and on us as a school. So I'm not giving it. And he got his colleagues in the math department to go along with it. And they also said, we're not giving it. So the school administration, of course, resisted. And the union actually wound up backing the teachers. And so they said, listen, none of the teachers in this high school will be giving this exam. And the Seattle School District said, well, fine, if you're not going to give the exam, then you all stay home that day and we will have substitutes to give the exam. And then students followed suit and they said, nope, we're not taking the exam. And so it got to be this really wide boycott of the standardized tests in Seattle, and people, again, arguing, listen, we are more than a score. So you're going to hear from both Jesse Hagopian and Malcolm London and some fellow students. You're going to read what they've had to say, and you're also going to read what Carol Burris, who's a principal in that system, has had to say about it. You'll also be listening to and watching a video of Malcolm delivering an excerpt of his poem. Okay, it's going to be called High School Training Grounds. It's a very powerful poem. This is just an excerpt of it. But I would encourage you to watch it and watch it several times. It's short, but watch it a few times. And I would also encourage you to share it with your fellow teachers and other people you think are into education. Following that, in the quiz here, I'm going to ask you to think about a couple of things. What did you hear from each of these folks? In their different roles? What would you ask them if you were in conversation with them? Okay, imagine yourself now as a school leader, and Jesse, Malcolm, and Carol are people in your district, or they're in your school. Maybe Carol is your principal. Maybe Jesse is your colleague. Maybe Malcolm is your student. Okay, what would you ask them? What more would you want to know from them as you get into this dialogue? And also, I'm going to ask you to take that a step further. Okay, how would you respond as an emerging leader in your school to each of these folks? Again, if Jesse taught down the hall, if Malcolm was one of your kids, or Carol was your principal, how would you respond to them individually, or even how would you respond to them all together? Okay, it's really good and powerful stuff. And finally, coming back to Malcolm, when we get together again in person, I'm going to ask you to think about this. I'm going to ask you to think, how is Malcolm smart based on what you've read and what you've seen, as opposed to how smart is Malcolm, right? Standardized testing argues that it's showing us how smart our kids are. Let's flip that question around in terms of multiple intelligences and say, well, how is Malcolm smart? How are our students smart? And that leads us to wondering, really, in fact, whether these tests are sensible and accurate assessments of what our students know and can do. And with that, I thank you. Hope you enjoy.